The most read piece at the Washington Post website for several days this week was not about our record heat. It wasn't about the president's NATO trip or the election. It was an article by my next guest, Christine Emba, called Men Are Lost. Here's a map out of the wilderness. While admitting that, yes, men still dominate business and politics and many other spheres of American life, Emba documents what she calls a widespread identity crisis. Among her supporting statistics, men now receive only about 74 bachelor's degrees for every 100 awarded to women. With women becoming increasingly selective, more single young men now live with their parents than a romantic partner. Men account for almost 3 of every 4 deaths of despair, either from suicide, alcohol abuse, or overdose. The person who's owned this issue, both on this program and most other forms of media, is Professor Scott Galloway, as Emba puts it before quoting him in the Washington Post piece on his podcast and in his newsletter. The author, entrepreneur, and professor at New York University's Stern School of Business has made a specialty of talking about the crisis of unattached, rudderless young men and helping them aspire to more. Well, joining me now are Christine Emba, ideas columnist for the Washington Post. By the way, she wrote the recent book, Rethinking Sex, A Provocation, and Scott Galloway. His most recent book is Adrift, America in 100 Charts. Scott, when we first talked about this months ago here on CNN, you actually thanked me for my willingness to discuss such a, you said, controversial subject. So now I'm wondering whether Christine's coverage and the enormous reaction means that the nation is ready to have this dialogue.
This is a masterclass in how powerful journalism is. There's a lot of us out there, and a lot of mothers and a lot of young men themselves, and people such as yourself who have felt something and have been talking about it. And Richard Reeves really moved the ball forward with his landmark book of Boys and Men. But this one article, this sort of tour de force, has inspired more dialogue and emails and real serious conversation than anything that I've been exposed to over the last year. So Christine and her good work speaks for itself. And let me just say, over the last couple of years, the conversation has gone from one that immediately inspires a gag reflex, where people sort of see compassion as a zero-sum game and feel that if you're advocating for men, somehow that's misogynistic or not recognizing the immense obstacles that non-whites and women still face, to something much more positive. And also, we're beginning to crowd out the terrible, quite frankly, unproductive voices that filled this void that was created because people felt the problem and were talking about it, but no one was addressing it. And then some terrible voices entered this void. And Christine's work, and I think other work, is starting to crowd out some of those thinly veiled misogynistic voices and have a more productive conversation. A long way of saying I agree with you, Michael, and Christine's done us all a real service.
Christine, what drew you to the subject matter, and speak to the enormity of the reaction?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Scott, for your kind words. I'll speak to the enormity of the reaction first. I have been overwhelmed by how quickly the piece has taken off, and how many people it feels like people were sort of waiting for someone to finally say it so that they could begin to have the conversation that they had been worried about for months, for years. As Scott was saying, people are worried about their sons, their brothers, in some cases their husbands. I get a good amount of email, but I've never gotten this much email from a single piece before. And, we run our comments section usually for 3 days. And the comments were shut down early because there were 10,500 comments on this one piece, which I cannot think of another article that's had that sort of response. So it really does feel like people are experiencing this in their lives. They're seeing their male friends and loved ones struggle, look for direction and not know where to find it. And, I'll say that I started thinking about this piece. Actually, you mentioned my book, Rethinking Sex. That book was sort of an investigation of sexual and relationship culture after Me Too, trying to figure out whether sort of our changes in norms had worked for us, if they had delivered what they promised. And I talked to a lot of young women for that book, but I also spoke to young men too. And it was from them that I found the most curious and saddening response. so many of them just seemed totally confused. The sands had shifted beneath them, as Scott lays out frequently. The economy has shifted in a way that doesn't necessarily favor manual labor skills where men used to dominate. Women are succeeding more in college and elsewhere, which, to be clear, is a great thing. Um, but young men didn't know what they were supposed to be doing or almost what they were for. Should I talk to women? Maybe I shouldn't talk to women anymore because that's seen as toxic somehow. So instead, they were just retreating. They were, staying in their rooms. They were, instead of trying to ask a real person out on a date, they were watching porn to feel like they were, getting their power back. They would begin to look up to these figures like, yeah, Andrew Tate, for instance, or Jordan Peterson. And they just didn't
Scott,
know what to do.
Scott, a part of this that you've addressed is the lack of sex, right? These guys are not having the type of relationships that young men of a different era would be having.
Look, we don't like to talk about it. We hear the word sex and our brain fires a bunch of different places. But think of, the whole shooting match, the whole reason we have an economy, the whole reason we're focused on creating a more prosperous, secure nation is such that we can all recognize what is the key to a rewarding life. And that is a series of deep, meaningful relationships. And core to that, or anchor to that, and I'm not saying you have to have this to be happy, is a productive, loving relationship with a partner. And you can look at the most unstable, violent societies in the world, and they all have one thing in common. They all have a disproportionate amount of young men who have no economic opportunity and also have no opportunity for relationships. And if we're going to have an honest conversation, we need to have an honest conversation. Sex and companionship are huge motivators and guardrails for young men. They put on a shirt, they blow dry their hair, they get their act together, they get a job. So the attributes, the peanut butter and chocolate of behaviors between masculinity and femininity make for a better world. And again, that's not to say that people along the middle of that continuum don't deserve the same respect and the same dignity. But most households prosper when there are risk-aggressive, rambunctious, more prone to action attributes of masculinity in concert with more thoughtful and more loving femininity. And when men aren't engaging in relationships with women, and women can't find men they find, quite frankly, sexually attractive, we're in trouble. The greatest innovation in history wasn't the computer chip, it wasn't the iPhone, it was the middle class. And the thing that gave birth to the middle class was 7 million men returning from war who were given jobs and money and low interest loans, and quite frankly, demonstrated the heroics and the economic security to be very attractive to a lot of women. And we had the baby boom and the inspiration and the formation of the greatest entity of good in the history of mankind, the American middle class. Sex, companionship are key. And 1 in 3 men under the age of 30 in the United States has not had sex in the last year. And quite frankly, that as an adult is when they become bad citizens. It's no one's obligation to service them, but we need more economically and more emotionally viable men such that we can have more household formation.
Christine, you wrote a book on this a year ago. Is he right?
I mean, I do think there's something to that. I think that one of the pushbacks that I've heard to this piece and to this conception of, men being lost, men needing more care, is the idea that there isn't anything specific, excuse me, about men, that, we should all just be good people, that there isn't a particular sort of set of masculine attributes or something called manhood that men specifically should aspire to. And, so they say, well, why are we focusing on them? We should kind of focus on everyone. And I think it's a nice thing to think. And I do believe that everyone is equal. But we have to think about, what we see in real life, realistically. There are attributes to being embodied as a man that are different than those that you see being embodied as a female. And actually being a good person means paying attention to those attributes, cultivating them where they're necessary, and figuring out how to channel them into pro-social roles. And we can be clear and say that there are many models for how to be a good man. There's not one kind of good man, but to actually aspire to be a good man is a good thing. And I think one of the places where, sort of the progressive movement especially has sort of lost footing here is by constantly saying that masculinity is toxic, by constantly talking down to men and, sort of suggesting that men are trash or men are scum, which is not aspirational, um, makes them feel resentful, and eventually drives them to seek role models who, sympathize with them and give them a path forward. It might not be a good path in the case of someone like Andrew Tate, but when it comes to looking for a model, if the choice is between nothing being offered or you're a bad person being offered and, hey, you're great, men are great, they're definitely going to choose the latter. And we're seeing this in polling, actually, especially in Gen Z, and we can see how this is going to become a political problem. Right now, fewer than 50% of Gen Z men say that feminism has been a good thing for America. So we're already seeing this resentment coming from lack of relationships, lack of support, lack of positive role models, and it is really going to redound down the line.
Christine, thank you for writing the piece. Scott, take 30 seconds and talk about solutions. Give me a note on which to end.
Red shirt young men, start them at 6 in kindergarten. They mature later. Their prefrontal cortex matures 12 to 24 months later. More vocational training. 50% of Germans have vocational certification. It's 5% in the United States. More freshman seats such that we can have not only more non-whites, more women, but also more young in terms of the great opportunity our elite universities offer. More third spaces so people can meet. National service so people can meet other people from different economic backgrounds, different sexual orientations, and also different romantic partners. Also, men like you and me, Michael, getting involved in young men's lives. The single point of failure we can reverse engineer all of this to is when a young man no longer has a male role model. So in sum, and where I'd leave it, is if we want better men, we need to be better men and get more involved in their lives.